All right, so let's get grounded. This was a 3-panel series, and this is the first panel of the series. And this is where scholar activists and movement leaders will discuss how they use education as a tool for liberation, which is this panel, how they conduct and apply research to advance social justice issues, which is the second panel, and how they integrate teaching/education, research, and activism on the last panel. And I want to iterate here, too, with this point that the people who are on all 3 of these panels could have been on all 3 of the panels, right? Because we're going to talk about these as reflexive issues, which they are. And, that means in a sociological sense that they all bounce off each other. So even though we have words for these things and we can talk about them individually, it's really a comprehensive conversation that we're having, but we are emphasizing the 3 aspects of a whole, right? Okay, and so these 2 points, the concept of education as a tool for liberation is longstanding. This isn't something I'm generating or coming up with. And as far as the sociologist that I am, and that we've been having this conversation for so very long, how these are reflexive processes and how they work together. So while we have words to describe them separately, they are reflexive processes in social justice advocacy, right? So within SWS, there's a Social Action Committee, and as with all the committees, there are co-chairs. I am one of them. I'm Ivania Woods. I've already introduced myself. I'm going to kick it over to Heather, who's going to introduce herself and get us into this panel discussion.
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon. I am Heather Halafka, she, her pronouns. I'm professor of Criminology and Law Studies at Marquette University in the Department of Social and Cultural Sciences. I am also the Social Action Co-Chair with Ivania. I study intersectionality, trauma, sexual violence, carceral systems, and transformative justice and embodiment. I have the pleasure of introducing the rest of the panelists, including Brittany Battle, Mallory Schwartz, Layla Salam, and Chris DeWeld. So Dr. Brittany Pearl Battle is an assistant professor in the sociology department and affiliate faculty at African American Studies program at Wake Forest University. She's also the co-founder of Triad Abolition Project, a grassroots organization based in Winston-Salem, working to dismantle the carceral state in North Carolina. Her research agenda includes social and family policy, courts, social justice, and carcerologics. She teaches courses on social justice, abolition, and transformative justice and courts and criminal procedure. Mallory Schwartz joining us, she, her pronouns. She is the executive director, of Abortion Action Missouri, formerly Pro-Choice Missouri, and the first Latina to hold this position. She formerly represented the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists as a policy manager. Mallory holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from St. Louis University and is currently a Master's of Public Health candidate at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Layla Salam is a reproductive justice advocate and recent graduate of George Washington University. She's taken her passion for international affairs and reproductive justice out of the classroom and into a career focused on educating her generation on the principles of reproductive justice. Layla currently serves as an organizer at Reproaction, where she advocates for self-managed abortion with pills, DC statehood, and expanding sexual health education. And last but not least, Dr. Chris DeWeld is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Professor of Sociology at the College of Charleston. She earned her PhD in Sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Chris specializes in the study of intersectional inequalities in higher ed and organizational change for academic justice, as well as liberation-focused pedagogies. Welcome to all. Welcome to everyone listening and joining us. Let's begin. We would like to ask each of the panelists to tell us a little bit about their journey into becoming an educator and how you've built and continue to build your confidence and ability to educate. We could start with Brittany and follow with Mallory, Layla, and then Chris. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks so much Ivania and Heather for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm super excited to join this conversation. So I just quickly about my journey to becoming an educator. I originally wanted to go to law school when I was an undergrad and quickly decided that was not the path for me because I had a professor that I saw myself in. And who made me really excited about research and teaching and community work. And so that's where I really started thinking about like what I wanted, what things were important to me in the future. And so I teach at a small liberal arts college that teaching is really important. Being a teacher scholar is really an important piece of the work that I do. And so how have I built and how do I continue to build my confidence? That's a hard question because I still feel nervous on the first day of every class, even though I've been teaching, college students at this point for over 10 years or more than 10 years. And so I just have my little tricks that I do to build up my, energy and release my anxiety on the first day of class. But part of it is that I look at educating as a symbiotic process and that I'm not the only educator in the room, that my students are also educating me and educating each other. And so that takes a little bit of the pressure off that I have to be the educator in the room and know everything and be able to answer every question. So for me, I think just reframing how I think about my approach to what happens in the classroom is definitely helpful for building my confidence and my teaching praxis.
Thank you. We have Mallory.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Brittany. Hi, folks. My name is Mallory Schwartz, they, she, her pronouns, and I'm the ED of Abortion Action Missouri, as was described. So Abortion Action Missouri is a statewide grassroots advocacy organization working on abortion access, as well as a host of intersecting issues that impact access to abortion. And my entrance to this work was through academia, actually. I was a survivor of sexual assault in college, and that led me to take a gender studies class. And it was in that class here in St. Louis, here in Missouri, at a Jesuit university, St. Louis University, that I had a professor who saw my interest in the subject area and helped me a little bit under the table, because St. Louis University is like I said, a Jesuit and non-supportive of the issue that I work in, helped me get an internship at this very organization more than a decade ago. And that really opened my eyes to how we put these issues that we were learning about into practice. And so I think for you all as educators and thinking about this, like that interest that professor took in me personally, like made all the difference. And I heard that in what Brittany said also, is like seeing yourself in that person, and those relationships really matter. And a lot of what I'm going to say throughout our conversation today is based in that relationship. And so when I think about how I've built my confidence in this work, it's grown over time just as I've done the work, but I think it's also based in relationship and in trust. And as I've built relationship with the lawmakers in our state, with the activists, with our partner organizations, I feel more confident in being able to stake the claim for our position and help educate folks on the connections between abortion and any other host of issues, whether it's tenants' rights or economic justice, really any variety of issues. I can tell you the connection to abortion, but the confidence to go into some of these spaces that have not historically been welcome to an organization like ours, whether it's a dusty back room of the State House, old boys club type thing, or whether it's just a space that folks say, well, we're not here to talk about abortion. It's coming in, having relationships in those rooms that gives me the confidence to say, no, we deserve to be here and we need to talk about how these issues intersect. So thanks for the opportunity to do that today here with you all, and I'll pass it on to our next panelist.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Heather and Ivania for having me here today. My name is Layla Salam. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently the DC organizer at Reproaction. I would say I came into this work a bit serendipitously. I think when I started this position, I knew that I would be organizing events around abortion access and increasing access to abortion and the tenets of reproductive justice in Washington, D.C., but I didn't necessarily know that I would be doing that through teaching people. And the main education that I've been doing in my position is I'm hosting events teaching people how to self-manage their abortions with pills. And I think becoming an educator for me has been a really interesting experience, because I think in a lot of these sessions that I'm holding with organizations and teaching people how to self-manage their abortions, how to help others with that, I'm in a room with people that I feel have so much to teach me as well, similarly to what Brittany was saying. And I think the way that I've built and continue to build my confidence is knowing that, similarly to what Brittany said, I don't have to know everything. And I'm often in the room with people who are nurses and people who have had abortions or have helped friends self-manage their abortions and have a lot of personal experience and stories to bring into the space. And I think making space for that and making space for the fact that I'm here to provide a certain toolkit and that there are other people in the room that can kind of fill out that toolbox has been really helpful for the way I approach educating in this kind of space, especially particularly with abortion pills and self-managed abortion that is constantly changing. So it's always helpful to be educating people who have so much lived experience and so much to add to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Just what an honor it is to be in this space with you all. I'll echo the gratitude to Ivania and to Heather for organizing this, and to my co-panelists for really setting a foundation for wisdom sharing in this space. So my name is Krista Weld. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm a first-generation Latina born to immigrant Cuban parents. And so I'm the first in my entire family to attend college. And my bachelor's degree took me just about a decade to complete, because higher education was really not structured in any way for me to get through, much less succeed. But I did eventually, and I continue to succeed. So I feel like the elder on this panel. I earned my PhD 20 years ago. And I do continue to succeed in higher education, surely because I'm tenaciously a hard worker, but I also want to name that some of my success is not incidentally because of other privilege I have as an able-bodied, cisgender, red as white person. And so in terms of my journey, the moment I stepped into a classroom as a TA in grad school, I knew that that was my path, was to be at a teaching focused institution and thriving in the classroom. But I was actively discouraged from completing my PhD to pursue those goals because my so-called mentors wanted me to advance their personal legacies and pursue R1 high research institution positions at high research institutions. And in fact, I had a really hard time finding a primary advisor with those goals. but I persisted, and I've now found my way to several colleges and universities that are teaching focused and that allow me to experiment and grow as an educator. So I would say that despite all of its shortcomings and history of sometimes violent oppression, I believe in the liberatory power of higher education. From the moment I realized that formal education was my own ticket to a form of freedom, I found my way to Bell Hooks, who inspired me as an educator to really embrace the classroom as the most radical space of possibility in the academy. That's a quote from her. And so I try to practice what Bettina Love calls freedom dreaming with students, offering opportunities for them to thrive in spaces that I facilitate. I love the term that Brittany shared with us about the symbiotic nature of classrooms. I fully believe that, and I try to live into that. But I think that doing that really requires us to approach things in a radically different way. So I read about pedagogy voraciously, and I'm constantly revising what I do and how I do it in service of education for liberation. And that is what really builds my confidence, is learning from others and reading about others' experiences. And I try to do so through a lens of humility, a practice of humility. That's really important to me.
Thank you, everyone. And Chris, that was a wonderful segue into us moving into talking about pedagogy between Brittany and Chris. If you want to start thinking about and speaking on how you teach for liberation, whose work and approaches inform your pedagogy?
I can jump in. So as a scholar who is also an organizer, I am really informed by the ways that grassroots organizations approach political education. And I think it's a very valuable tool for me in the classroom. And so my pedagogy is really informed and guided by an abolition feminist approach, a Black radical feminist approach. You know, of course, folks like Bell Hooks are, you know, informing a lot of us and how we approach the classroom. And so for me, to give like some concrete examples, some things that are important in my pedagogical approach is, one is breaking down these symbolic and material barriers between the university and communities that surround the universities, you know, both literally surrounding the university and figuratively surrounding the university. I work on a campus that is a bubble that is, you know, enclosed by gates. And so for me, making sure the students are getting off of campus, are having relationships, as you know, many of my co-panelists have pointed out, this relationship building piece is really important. And so, for example, a couple things that I do in my classes toward that end include, in my abolition course, I have students facilitate virtual teach-ins on a topic related to abolition that are open to the public. When I did this the first time, Mariam Kaba retweeted the flyers for the teach-ins, which was super exciting for the students, but also made them super anxious that someone as well known as Mariam Kaba was retweeting the flyers on her page. I also have, in my social justice course, I have students working directly with grassroots organizations. So they get put into pairs or trios and then assigned to an organization that I have relationships with in the local community. And they contribute to the work that the orgs are doing in some way. And so, for example, one of the groups of students worked with a reproductive justice organization who was contributing to rebuilding the supply of diapers and menstrual products at a diaper bank that lost all of their products because of a fire. And so the students raised almost $1,000 on campus to donate to families directly who were in need of those types of supplies. Other organizations worked with a housing and tenants' rights organization doing research about co-ops and land trusts that was useful for the organization. So I try to do things that are, and all of these things, of course, these come from relationship building, right? We can't just drop students into the community when I, as the professor of the course, don't have a relationship, or I don't have any sense of what's happening in the local community. So those are things I have to build first, so I can make sure when I'm sending students out that, this is not a savior project, right? That is not the approach. I train the students extensively in what their orientation should be when they're going into the community. And so those are some of the, types of things I try to do to use the classroom as a site of liberation, as Chris pointed out, which is, I think our call as educators to really, not think about, as Ivania pointed out, like research, teaching, and activism. These are not separate things. These are things that are all, connected to liberation. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Chris.
Thank you, Brittany. What powerful examples of really transforming student lives in the same moment that institutions and communities are being transformed, and again, symbiotically. So as I mentioned, bell hooks is my pedagogical North Star, but I'm also guided by other Black, Indigenous, and Latina scholars, including, as I mentioned, Bettina Love, Angela Davis, and specifically her work on abolition, Adrienne Marie Brown, Laura Rendon, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, and Paulo Freire, of course. The themes that I think thread together these pedagogies include many of the things that Brittany has mentioned directly, and that I think we all sort of alluded to in our introduction statements. The values of wholeness, of critical self-reflection, community, connection, lived experience as both imparting knowledge and wisdom. And I think that that comes from Black feminist epistemology, right? The importance between understanding knowledge and wisdom as both being critical components of education, but also diminished hierarchies and shared decision making, which can be very tricky in the classroom. And then, of course, a robust critique of power, privilege, and oppression, both in the classroom dynamics as well as in the content of the courses that I facilitate. I work from the positionality that education has not been, is not currently, and never will be apolitical or value-free. And that really sort of guides me. I would say I aim to practice radical inclusivity, which activates my own empathy to students' struggles, fully recognizing that those struggles can't be divided between what's happening inside and outside the classroom. So specifically what that looks like, or at least one strategy, is that my syllabus is always a work in progress. It's a living document. It's finished when the semester is finished. And so I'm constantly revising and adapting in collaboration with students and in response to what's happening in the world and in their lives. I try to offer space for reciprocity in the learning context. And again, this notion of symbiosis, students as teachers and teachers as students. I invite questions as guides for our work, being really flexible in the content that's covered based on the questions that emerge from students. I think that contributes to their self-awareness and self-confidence, which I, of course, hope that they carry into other spaces. Specifically, I'm more recently inspired by educators who practice alternative grading and ungrading specifically, that is the removal of grades within a course. And so some of those folks are Jessie Stommel, Susan Bloom, Asao Inouye, and that's a strategy for equitizing higher education. Yeah, I really could go on and on about this. This conversation is what really activates and inspires me, but I'll stop there so that we have more time for other questions.
Thank you both. That moves us into deliberately talking about empowering learners. So thinking about the conversation of power, empowering this knowledge and wisdom being shared. We can talk about or answer the question, how do you empower learners and cultivate passion and hope in these learning spaces? So we'll turn to our next two panelists, starting with Mallory.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear that former question, and I hear a lot of connections. So at Abortion Action Missouri, as a grassroots advocacy organization, we don't do education in the formal academic sense, but we do educate in a few different ways. One is basic education to lawmakers and leaders on issues and policies in exactly kind of how you would expect, right? We have white papers and one-pagers and fact sheets and all the facts and information, and work to get that in front of the folks as they're making decisions in our state. In our state, Missouri, as folks can imagine, that doesn't always get us very far. And so that takes me to the other format of education that we offer, which is education to the public, basic political and civic education. And the way we do that is less about those facts and much more helping people make connections between their lived experiences and greater issues. We know that everyone has a reproductive health story, whether it's abortion, miscarriage, pregnancy, the sex ed you had or didn't have, accessing birth control, facing a partner's unintended pregnancy, being able to access STI or other reproductive health care, access to menstrual products. We all have one of these stories, and we work to help folks understand that these are universal issues and that they are issues that they can have power over in trying to change the systems that have created the barriers we face in accessing this basic care. And we work to train folks on these issues in a couple different ways. One of our mainstreams of work has been through a deep canvas program. And that means we go into the community and have intentional and long form conversations on the doors about what people feel about abortion, what they feel about their reproductive healthcare access. And we have to train our canvassers really intently on how to do this, because these are complex and nuanced conversations and can be sensitive. And what we want is for people to come away making these connections and also feeling empowered to then go have those conversations with their communities, with their families. And what's interesting is within Deep Canvas, the hardest thing to do has been to help our canvassers understand that they aren't there to persuade or convince anyone. We don't need them to show up on the doors and say, well, here's the facts about the percent of abortions at different times, or here's the facts about the cost, or here's the facts. What we need to do is listen and ask questions. And it's in asking those questions, have you ever known someone who struggled to get the health care they needed, or who faced an unintended pregnancy? What did that person's experience make you feel like? How did you try to support that person in your life? That's what allows us to guide people to connect their experiences to these broader issues and to recognize the systems of oppression that put them in that position. And this work has to be rooted in relationship also, and people need to feel safe to be able to share. And when you show up on someone's door, you probably don't have a pre-existing relationship with them. And so it's, how do we approach these conversations with empathy and openness, and starting not from a place of, hi, I'm pro-choice, what are you, right? But I just want to understand what you think about this issue, and I'm here to hear what you think about this issue. And what's really powerful about Deep Canvas is that we don't, there is a information collection aspect of it. This is meant to help us learn broader things about where our state community is on these different issues. And so we do ask people to rate themselves on a scale of essentially how pro-life or pro-choice are you? Where is your support kind of on this scale? And at the end of the conversation, we ask them again, how do you feel now? And Deep Canvas has proven, not just in this issue area, but in many different issue areas, to move people on a scale towards a better level of understanding. This is a really proven strategy. These transformative conversations of moving people around issues of race as well. And this is hard work. And so I see a question that was asked in the chat about how we support mental health and disability and create inclusive environments. And I know that's an academic question too, but one of the ways that we do that is to try to create the supports that our team needs, that our canvassers need, so that they can take care of themselves, so that we are approaching, so that we aren't approaching burnout, because we're creating an environment that empowers people to take the time and space and have the support they need. And there's lots of ways to do that in a nonprofit administrative space. We have unlimited vacation at our or unlimited PTO at our organization, and we push people to take the time off when they need it and not let that build up. We provide spaces for people to just have fun and be together. And I think that for civic education with our membership is really important too. It's one thing to ask folks, call your lawmakers, take this action, do these things, knock on these doors, but to just create safe and fun spaces for people to engage and be in community together is often the thing that, again, builds that relationship and connection, but also empowers someone to want to come back to a space to do what can be really hard and challenging work. And I will pass it over to Layla.
Thank you so much, Mallory, for that really insightful answer. I think in the context of self-managed abortion and teaching people how to use abortion pills, I think it's a very empowering lesson inherently. And I think a lot of people, the slogan that is used around self-managed abortion a lot is in our own hands, on our own terms. So I think essentially as a practice, self-managed abortion is a very empowering thing. And I think a lot of times in any social movement, when people are trying to learn and position themselves to be leaders and advocates in a movement, it's hard to walk away from some conversations with something tangible. And I think giving people something tangible and a skill empowers them. And I think that's the feedback that I have received the most from people who have engaged in my self-managed abortion sessions. Like, they felt like they left an hour-and-a-half conversation with a skill that they can use forever and a skill that can't be taken away from them. And I think that part is how I feel what I'm doing and the things that I'm teaching empower learners. But I think also on the other side of that same coin, the landscape of self-managed abortion can be inherently a little bit disheartening, especially when we're looking at the fact that mifepristone, one of the abortion medications, is very up for debate in the Supreme Court. And people do feel a bit of helplessness when I'm bringing that to the forefront and updating them on what that looks like. So I think in those moments where we have to look at our movement and we're facing a difficult moment where something could be taken away from us, the way that I try to empower and inspire hope in those moments are just calling attention back to the Indigenous women, particularly that we got these practices from, particularly with self-managing our abortions with misoprostol, and knowing that people have always self-managed their abortions with these medications or without. People will continue to self-manage their abortions. And that is not dependent on what happens in a higher court. And I think that giving people that perspective and understanding the longevity of this practice can be very hope inspiring in these learning spaces. And I think those are kind of the tactics that I try to use. I think the most empowering thing about self-managed abortion is I've heard directly from people who I've taught how to use abortion pills, that they've then taken that information to help someone else. And I think, again, as I mentioned, getting that direct skill and being able to put that into practice immediately into your life, into your personal life, into your professional life, is very empowering in and of itself.
Thank you very much. So with increasing emphasis in higher ed on teaching to the career, on these capitalist goals, we had hoped that panelists might address very briefly the issue of thinking about hierarchical social arrangements in their work. I think Mallory just gave us some wonderful examples of addressing different abilities in a variety of spaces. So if we could very briefly discuss these social arrangements in learning space dynamics, beginning with Brittany. Thank you.
Sorry, y'all, I was getting back to the unmute. So briefly, for me, the way that I address hierarchies is working to abolish my own internal cop, as abolitionist organizers say. So I'm guided by this quote from Miriam Kaba, and she says, when we set out trying to transform society, we must remember that we ourselves will also need to transform. And so this is important as educators, right? Because a lot of us, are trained to, be very kind of policing towards our students and towards our colleagues. And this is not just with grading, right? This is also with like the ways that people show up in spaces, their bodies, how loud they talk, whether or not they curse, like all of these things, right? That we're like, oh, this is not decorum. And that's a big problem. And all of those things are grounded in white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism and colonialism and imperialism and all of these things. And a lot of it comes from ourselves, right? Not necessarily from the ways that policing external to ourselves happen. So for me, that's what I can say about how I attempt to address that. And that's not just in my teaching, right? That's in all of my interpersonal relationships, and also how I like respond to myself, right? Like how I think about me and loving myself and not allowing my own vision or perspective of myself to be impacted by all of these oppressive forces and forcing me to like police myself and be nasty to myself. So yes, I will stop there.
Thank you. I'll really briefly say that I think to add to everything that Brittany said, which is I think the foundation is how do we look at creating opportunities for everyone that aren't based on their position, that aren't based on whether they're a leader in a different space. An example is we have our board meetings open to our whole team so that everyone can build those relationships with leaders in the organization and get to know people and hear the information. How do we invite newer staff to present at different things? How do we make sure that we're creating opportunities for volunteers to take on leadership? And how are we always just working to welcome people into new opportunities and leadership spaces that don't depend on how long they've been around or what their skills on paper are or something like that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you both again so much. This is a wonderful conversation. We also see that many of our teaching, research, and activist spaces have increasingly perhaps grown more hostile to ideas of science, truth, evidence. So we wanted to ask the panelists what advice you might have for educators working in these learning spaces and activists learning in these working spaces. So I'll leave the conversation to Leela and Chris.
I think in the space that I'm particularly navigating, what I'm coming across in this lens is people have come this far in their lives and they have a lot of misconceptions about the idea of self-managed abortion and a lot of false misconceptions that they hold very closely. And I think a lack of understanding of why someone would choose to self-manage their abortion over an in-clinic abortion. And I think the way that I've addressed kind of these really pervasive ideas and maybe negative ideas about people taking their medical care into their own hands is opening space for them. I think opening space in that kind of context for the fact that, oh, I've heard this thing, and then being able to talk about lived experience and why people might choose to self-manage their abortion over taking a more in-clinic route. And I think what has been the most successful for me is allowing people to express their grievances and then being able to kind of work backwards from that, and kind of untangle all of those things and understand where some of these beliefs are really tied into, as we were just talking about, white supremacy and capitalism and the way we think about healthcare and the way people should be able to access healthcare. And I think breaking down what those misconceptions and like false narratives look like into the root of them, which really typically I find are related to white supremacy culture, and all of these different things, I think is very useful to opening people's eyes to a practice that they might see as a last resort or something similar. Thank you.
Thanks, Layla. I think we press on and we do our best not to capitulate to the anti-science, anti-fact fringe that is probably louder than they actually are in size. But I think it's critically important to manage our own self-preservation, of course. And I think in solidarity with my colleagues from Florida, where I'm from and taught for more than a decade, and certainly Florida is not the only space, where educators have to be stealth and veil or even water down their pedagogies and their content in the current moment. So my advice to those navigating those contexts is to survive and self-preserve, joining the resistance and what Harvey and Moten call the undercommons for refuge and for sustenance in contexts that are less hostile right now. I think we double down on evidence in all of its diversity. We make it so that facts are irrefutable and stand in opposition to uninformed ignorance. So for example, when I teach about pay inequality, even as a qualitative scholar, I bombard students with numbers, hard numbers from a variety of sources that really can't be argued away. When I give talks about inequalities and inequities in faculty careers as an invited speaker on another campus, for example, I draw on a robust set of national data that irrefutably document the horizontal and vertical segregation in the academy, diminished opportunities, bias in recruitment, hiring and retention. And the naysayers they're never satisfied, but they go quiet when we use data strategically. And then I think, coming back to the theme of our panel, I think we also have to invite questions so as to unpack where the broken links are, right? What's informing the hostility? So critical pedagogies compel us to teach and learn through questions. And while I might have my facts and my numbers straight, I'm never too rigid in their presentation, and particularly with students. Audre Lorde suggested that we teach our students questions, right? That's the best that we can do as educators, is teach our students questions. So I guess that's what I try to do to help them find their way out of the misinformation, the ignorance, the anti-science, etc.
Fabulous. Thank you again. So we have the rest of time to wrap up a little bit and thinking about this wonderful conversation with any suggestions for sources on improving teaching skills in the interest of advancing social justice issues or in our teaching and activist spaces. We will start with Brittany and continue with Mallory, Leila, and Chris. Thank you.
So just quickly, I would say, as I mentioned before, like my teaching is guided by praxis that is not necessarily about teaching. And so but it is, because all these things are connected. And so for me, like thinking about justice, and so books like Care Work, and I can put the name of the author in the chat, Leah Lakshmi Piepsma Samaransinha. I really do my best to pronounce her name, but so texts that are not necessarily speaking to teaching, as I said, but like that text about care work helps us think about disability justice and helps us think about an orientation that's rooted in care and compassion. And so for me, like thinking about those questions help inform how I move and show up in the classroom. And so I think my general suggestion would be to think about what you want your praxis to be guided by, and even if sources or resources are not like about teaching themselves, you can still draw from the ideas, the tools, the strategies, the frameworks, the ecosystems that are shared by organizers, by scholars who are talking about how to move in a liberatory praxis. I'll stop there.
Yes, similarly, I think look at the intersectionality of issues. Abortion Action Missouri is not a reproductive justice organization, but we've made a commitment to work within the reproductive justice framework and lens. And when we first did this, it required a lot of learning, but also relationship building. We don't have to be the experts on everything, on early childhood education policy, but we can be in a relationship with those folks so we know how to best support them. And I heard Chris speak on humility before. We don't always get it right, but how can we approach and say, look, we got this wrong, and and next time we want to do better and be in better relationship. And so looking at the leaders in reproductive justice, at the Sister Song Reproductive Justice Collective, and Loretta Ross and other writers and founders of that movement is a way that we look to grow those connections with our own work. And then Brittany said at the very top, but connect with the movement groups in your area. We also work locally with universities that send us interns as part of different classes that are hosted, and it can really help students understand the on-the-ground impact and the ways that they can put their learnings into practice and into action. And I think that is an invaluable opportunity for students, and it also is invaluable for us as often under-resourced nonprofit organizations to have student power to help us bring new learnings, new education, new research to support and build the foundation for the work that we do every day. I'll pass it to Layla.
Thank you, Mallory. I think this was an interesting question for me because I definitely still see myself very much as a student, but I think similarly to what Mallory was talking about, what I've found the most useful, especially in this space, is learning from personal experience and specifically from storytellers. And I think abortion storytelling is a very powerful medium as far as this social justice movement, but in every social justice movement, there are people who are storytellers who have lived experience, who can bring all of these things that we're trying to teach kind of to the forefront and to reality for people that we are teaching to. And I think that's one of the most valuable resources of social justice movements are the storytellers and lived experience. And I think that's what I draw the most inspiration from in trying to dip my toe into teaching others about something, while I may not feel like an expert in all of the things. And I'll pass it.
Thanks all. So suggestions for sources on improving teaching skills. one of the things that I find is that it's important for folks to understand that education for liberation is really an ethos, it's an orientation, it's a set of values. There are strategies, and many of them we've talked about today, some that we adopt. For me, I don't assign grades. That's something I've been doing for about 4 or 5 years, and that's a strategy, but there are no tricks or shortcuts to this work. I think it's important to keep that at the forefront, that it's really a way of orienting to the world, to ourselves and to others. I think our biggest resources in this work are really humility and curiosity. I love what Mallory said about not needing to know everything. That's a praxis of humility, especially in social justice spaces, which many of us aim to cultivate in the spaces that we facilitate, whether those are formal classrooms or in deep canvassing or the other kinds of spaces that have been elevated to the conversation today. I do somewhat regularly maintain a Google Doc with resources on liberation-focused pedagogies, anti-racist pedagogy, indigenous. I trouble the notion of decolonization, so I provide some resources in this document on indigenous pedagogies as well. I'm happy to share that. I can't seem to share that with attendees, but I can share that with the organizers, and maybe they can share that out as well. So while I think that it's an ethos, an orientation, a set of values, and I hold that very dear, I do think there are things we can learn from each other, and hopefully this space has done that. I know it has for me, and resources that we can use to deepen our practice. But there's really no, everyone's always looking for like a tip or a strategy or what can I do to make my classroom more equity minded? And it's like, well, you have to maybe think about what you're doing first, rather than adopting some sort of practice. So that's the advice I would have.
All right. I want to thank the panelists for being amazing, showing up, and having this incredible conversation. I want to encourage folks to register for the second panel of this series coming up on November 1st. It is called Research is Activism. You can register the same way you registered for this one, by going to Reproaction's website. You can Google Research is Activism, Reproaction. It'll come up, the resource page. You can get it there. There may be a Facebook event on Reproaction's page, or you can also go back to the same email that you registered from this one, or to my personal Facebook if you registered that way. But really appreciate it. This is a series, and so the next panel, well, getting into that, it'll also be a mix of movement leaders and scholars, and we have the executive director of Reproaction, a person from Goobmacher coming through. Sorry that your name escapes me if you're on this one, sorry. And scholar activists who are a part of SWS, and we'll be continuing this conversation. We're getting out of here on time, folks. Don't worry. And last but certainly not least, I want you to check us out. You can follow Reproaction on all forms of social media except for TikTok, at Reproaction. You can email us, reproaction@reproaction.org. You can visit our website at reproaction.org. And also follow Sociologist in Society. We're doing some very interesting things over there. If you are a sociologist and are not a member and want to become a member, help keep us afloat and become a member by paying your dues. Come join us at our conferences. But you can also follow them at Social Women and on X. But There's also a Facebook page. You can also visit our website at socialwomen.org. And again, this is brought to you by the Social Action Committee for Sociologists for Women in Society and also Reproaction. Keep up with us. Thank you for joining. Going to give you back 3 minutes of your morning if you're on anything other than Eastern time, or your afternoon if you're on Eastern time. And again, appreciate y'all for attending. Hopefully y'all make it to the second and or the third panel. Thank you.